Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to another episode of Coder Conversation. Today, we have a very special guest, Steve Johnson. How you doing today, man?
I'm very good. How are you?
Oh man, can't complain, man. I'm doing well.
Good,
Doing
good.
well, man. So yeah, do you mind giving people a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. Let's see. How far back you want to go? Well, let's go to childhood a little bit because we're going to talk about programming. So I grew up in Southern California in the 80s. Um, Breakdancing was a thing. I remember us riding to school with cardboard strapped to our backs so that we could breakdance at lunch. That was a thing. It was sort of the emergence of like freestyle bicycles. So like a lot of that was happening. Street skating. I mean, it was a pretty cool time. I lived out in the country. It wasn't cool there, particularly. We were pretty isolated, pretty. I lived pretty sheltered, I think, and so for me, like books first, and then the computer really sort of became my window into a bigger world. Um, my I remember I saw a computer at a friend's house for the first time, probably like 1982, and I think my first computer was a Texas Instruments 994A, and that was probably like 1983, so I would have been 8 then. Um,
It sounds
I I think the thing that fascinated me about it was that we barely had television, and then I was over at this friend's house, and I'm looking at the thing, and it's television, and you're interacting with it, and it was primitive, especially by today's standards, it would have been massively unimpressive, but um, to me at that moment it seemed extremely cool, and the potential for it seemed super cool.
yeah, it kind of seems like you grew up in the golden age where technology was there, but it didn't completely overtake society. And
It was pretty new still. I think I was kind of the second generation that grew up with computers, and the first generation, you really like that was rich people or kids whose parents worked for the phone company, or like your hackers, those OG guys, Captain Crunch, that sort of thing.
mhm,
Um, so people breaking into the phone systems, and
yeah.
then the PC happened, right? So right around then, late 70s, early 80s, that was really the first time that it was affordable enough that people like me could get into the game.
Okay. So like when you got your first computer, can you give us that experience?
Yeah, so it was so the funny thing is that the TI was it was kind of the competitor to the Commodore 64, which was actually the machine to have at the time, right? If you wanted to play games, everybody was making good ones for the C64. The TI was kind of billed as a more educational computer. It's kind of funny. Cosby was actually the rep for the
Oh,
TI in the day, which doesn't age too well. But um, that machine was fun because it when you booted up, it booted into BASIC, right? And so um, that was kind of their target audience was, I guess, people like me who wanted a computer to sort of learn how to make it do things. Um, so that was available right as soon as you powered it on. The downside is that um, there was no disk drive, right? So you couldn't store any of your programs. You would type them in, and then you would run them, and when you turned the computer off, it was all lost.
wow.
And that was an era too where as I was learning, I was mostly just typing in code listings out of magazines. This is pre-internet, so I don't remember what the name of the magazine that I subscribed to, but it would have like basic listings, and you could type those in and execute them. Sometimes you had to tweak them for the platform, but yeah, I mean that was kind of my intro. I was fascinated from the jump. Um, I got into it at 8. I begged my parents to send me to a computer camp when I was like 12, and I kind of that was when I first got access to people who actually knew what they were doing. Like I was there and I saw the kids. So I was like 12. There were some older kids there, probably 17, who were doing assembly programming, and that was the first time that I knew that there was a different level to interact with the machine at that I wasn't capable of doing yet, but they were making way cooler stuff than I was making, and I was super intrigued, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, that's the very early bit. Um, I can jump forward to sort of like university area era. So we moved to a little town on the Washington side of the Columbia River. So we're in Southwest Washington. Um, I get older. I apply to the UW, get in here, sort of pre-computer science, um, and I drop out after 2 years for a couple of reasons. One one was that I was out of money, right? Like
Mm.
we were just broke, and I didn't. My parents had sort of like beaten into me as a kid that like you don't want to get into debt. That was sort of a prime directive, uh, and so for good or bad, that was kind of the choice I made. I started like looking at places where I could get work with what I knew, and I eventually went to a contract agency in town, and they hooked me up with a tech support job at a game company in town called Humongous, and that was my first gig. So I was 20 years old. um, I was not getting in as a programmer, but that was certainly, that was the angle that I was coming at it from. I was like, well, this is my in, right? So I sort of came in the side door.
Absolutely. Did you have a love of games prior to jumping into the industry? Is that
Yeah,
something
of
you really?
course. I kind of think that everyone, I might be, this might be my bias talking, but I think that everyone who becomes interested in programming probably is also interested in games at some point in their
Mhm.
life. So yeah, I mean, that was the thing that you could kind of do with computers. Mostly, they weren't very useful in those early years. You could run a not very good word processor. You could play games. What else? I mean, eventually GUIs kind of came to the table, that sort of thing. But it games were where it was at, and obviously I was a kid too, so that was what I was interested in doing.
Absolutely. What were some of the games you were interested in?
Let's see, what was I playing in those early days? I can name a couple of real obscure titles from that TI. There was one called Parsec. Um, it had a voice synthesizer module. There was actually like a piece of hardware that you could plug into the side of the machine. And when you played Parsec, then you would get this sort of robot voice that would tell you what level it was or whatever.
Oh,
I also remember playing some of the early. This would actually cross over to larger audiences, but probably like audiences from the late '70s. But the old Scott Adams adventure games, the text adventures, so like
mhm.
Pirate Adventure, stuff like that. Um, those were kind of fun because I also played them on the TI. They're fun to talk about anyway, because again, there was no disk drive, and the way that those games worked on that system, because they were fairly large, and cartridge memory was really expensive. So what they sold you was an adventure cassette that you put in the machine, and then you would load in the memory on there from a cassette tape that you plugged into the side of the thing, and it basically had a sound on a cassette that sounded like a modem, right?
Mhm.
And that was essentially what was happening. Is it was just doing the codec of all this digital data on an old style cassette, and that load the game, take about 10 minutes, and then you were in, baby.
Yeah, man, it was completely different back then. So like did you start dabbling and making your own games before jumping into the industry?
I did, yeah. The one that I remember especially like really wanting to recreate as a kid was Bubble Bobble. I don't know if you have ever
Mhm.
seen that one, but it's an old, I think it's Bandai,
Mhm.
um, kind of an old platformer, like this sort of arcade game that I probably played at a Pizza Hut at one of those sit-down cocktail tables when I was
Mhm.
a kid. Loved that. Um, Wanted desperately to make it, but lacked the technical ability, the artistic ability, and the hardware to run it. So, you know, I made little sort of toy games, I think, in those early days.
Sure. Do you remember any of the games that you made? Can you tell us a little bit about them?
They were mostly clones. So things like I would make things like asteroids, right?
Mhm.
or and I made I think I took a crack at something that was like Pitfall, right? Like a side-scrolling, multi-screen sort of adventure game, those sorts of things.
What language were you using to make those games?
Those were a combination, like I think early on of BASIC, and then I think later there were sort of early, for lack of a better term, game engines, I guess. So there were like game. I can't even remember the titles anymore. We're filtering this through decades, but there were like game creator kits where you could sort of like draw out the graphics, build your sprites, primitive versions of the sorts of things that you would see today for like 2D adventure creators.
So I know like game development is really math heavy, and they don't have nearly the amount of educational resources back then that they do now. So how did you pick up on the math to be able to make games?
Yeah, I think I picked it up later. Truth be told, I had a reasonable math background, so like, I had gone through most of the university math requirements by the time I dropped out. And those early years too, I was really hungry. And when I dropped out, I had made this sort of commitment to myself that I bought all of the university textbooks for the remainder of my coursework, and I would read those at night when I wasn't at work to try and sort of augment my education. But really, it wasn't until like it came time to put it into practice, which was probably the move to Sucker Punch for me. At that point, things like linear algebra and matrix math and the sorts of operations that are important in 3D games became a lot more important to me. And so it was about then that I really sort of got serious about it. I think in all the cases, I was the sort of person who I've always learned pretty well from books. There's a lot of stuff out there if you're willing to go find it, and that worked out for me.
Sure. So Jonathan Jennings, he just joined. He's also in the game industry, and when he first got in, he said he had to put in like 300 job applications to get that first job. Was your experience similar, or?
No, and my experience is totally not representative. I feel like I said, I sort of slipped in the side door. What I did was I got a contract job at a game company. I didn't know anything about the game company at the time. It turned out to be amazing. I can get into some details about it, but the place that I landed, I just got very lucky. And I worked crazy hard to then make the most of my shot. But I got in the door in tech support. I worked crazy hard there. I was building software for them on the side in addition to just like taking calls. And after about 3 months of a 6-month contract, they bought me out of it. So then I became a permanent hire. And then about 6 months after that, I had managed to like railroad enough coworkers into conversation and sort of like corner the systems programmer, and really like I let these people know that I was super interested. And with the next time that there was a round of hiring for game programmers, I applied and I got in. It's also probably worth saying that these weren't highly technical programming jobs at the time. It would have been it was a scripting language. And so what you were mostly doing is wiring up game logic as a game programmer at Humongous. So Humongous, if you don't know the name, we made children's adventure games, essentially like Putt Putt, Freddy Fish. If you're of a certain age, you probably played some of these. We had we did a series of Blue's Clues games that came a little bit later, but it was a cool place. Really kind of a island of misfits. A lot of people came to that place through sort of non-traditional paths. And because of that, I don't know. Everyone was interesting. Also, I was young. And so a lot of this is really tied up in my youth, but I thought I was hanging out with the coolest, most sophisticated like crowd of geniuses that I'd ever run across. And it was kind of magic there.
Damn right it was.
Yeah. Did any of y'all guys got questions? I don't want to hog everything.
I'm kind of listening right now. I just got here, so I didn't want to just kind of jump in.
Okay. So yeah, can you tell us how you eventually transitioned to Sucker Punch?
Yeah. So, okay. So as I said, I was a game programmer on one game. Oh, I'll tell a little story about that. So the only game that I've ever, as an individual, made and that the public has played was the mini game on Spy Fox's watch. It was called Happy Fun Sub. And it was a side-scrolling sort of shooter where you had a plane that could turn into a boat that could turn into a submarine. I'm pretty sure I stole the idea from a game that I played when I was a child, but it's one of those things where it came through such a hazy memory that I've gone back and searched for it recently, and I cannot find, like, if that thing exists, I don't know what it's called. So maybe it's actually an original invention and I just dreamed it. I'm not sure. But that was super fun. And then there was an opening in the systems department. And what I really was fascinated by, like I said, in the early days, I was very curious about what made it go at the lower level. Like I wanted to know about how people interacted in assembly, like how the machine worked. For me, like the systems programming role, which was basically building the engine that the game programmers would then sort of build, all the sort of game logic on. That was the place where I really wanted to be, and I got a shot at that after, like I said, it was a year or two. I think about a year and a half, and I had been there for quite a few years. Then, like that first gig, I worked for seven years. And really kind of, I started, like I said, at the very bottom. And then I by the time I left, I was the head of the systems group. And I think the reason that I left, I know the reason why I left. I had a couple of friends who were at Sucker Punch at that time. A couple of artists, actually, who had comic book backgrounds and super talented people. And I saw the first Sly Cooper come out, and I wanted that to be the game that we were making at Humongous. We had taken a swing several times at console games, and for a bunch of reasons, we couldn't get it off the ground. The economics weren't right, or the technology wasn't the right thing at the right time. In any case, I had friends over there, and I saw this game, and I was like, that is the thing that I want to be working on. And so, I put in an application, went through a pretty rigorous interview process. That was, I think, the first time that I had really sort of seen the Microsoft style, especially during that era, interview. And it was rough, but I managed to either charm or somehow I convinced them that I deserved the job. And I stayed there for a number of years. That was another really awesome gig. Super proud. I remain super proud of those Sly Cooper titles.
So I know, like during the PlayStation 2 era, the PS2 was notorious for being hard to program. The graphics synthesizer, motion engine. How did you deal with that? How did you get up to speed with that?
Okay, so we can tell some stories about this. I prepped some material a little bit. The PS2 was a cool machine, and it was super cool to work on because that era still was pretty Wild West. Like companies were building exotic hardware that was a one-off design. It wasn't like anything else. Nintendo did that a bunch of times. Sony did that 3 times in a row. It was cool. And the thing that was cool, so by this time I had pretty extensive PC experience, right? I was pretty solid. I could write and optimize code, C++ and assembly, and pretty knew the stack real well. but I had not dealt with things like the PS2 had a specialized DMA controller that could do crazy stuff like scatter gather writes, where you could take a discontinuous block of memory and say, I want to take every 4 bytes, every 16 bytes, and then write those into a contiguous region of memory. Or I want to do the opposite of that operation. So I've got like a structure of arrays that I then splay out into an array of structures, or vice versa. There were 2 CPUs in there, right? So there was the SPU, which was actually the old PS1 processor. That's how they ran all the sort of PS1 games in emulation. They just had the PS1 chip in there. But for us, if you were running in the PS2 mode, then you had that thing running sounds, and it had some extra bandwidth. And I remember writing, I only wrote one program that ran on the SPU, and it was for calculating the root mean square of the signal power of your mouth, so that when you, if you shouted into the headset, you could distract guards, that sort of thing. It was silly. It was kind of a gimmicky feature, but we were trying to support the headset. What other cool stories do I have about that time? Ask away, and let me dial something up.
Sure. Did you guys have any questions?
First of all, super excited to talk to you, and so I think I have a lot of questions, but I guess kind of one of the questions I thought about coming into this is, you talked about Sly Cooper, and I think Sly Cooper and Wind Waker were the first times I remember seeing cell shaded visuals, right?
Yeah.
And so was that interesting to you? Like, did you like?
Very much so.
Yeah.
I think I have always kind of been drawn more towards stylized versus realistic rendering. I don't know. I dig that aesthetic. I think it's for the same reason that paintings might be more interesting than photographs, I suppose. I'm not sure. But yeah, the cool thing about that too is it was very much a sort of, as I was thinking about what I wanted to like, stories I wanted to tell, I was thinking about, is there any sort of theme that ties this all together? And it's constraints, right? Like, that's the cool thing about console programming specifically, but game programming in general is all about how do I fit within these constraints? How do I run on this tiny amount of memory? And for us, like on the Sly games, we took massive advantage of that cell shading look to keep the data sizes low, right? Like, we got away with 4-bit textures on that game because it was toon shaded. You didn't need a huge palette of color, and then the shading engine would sort of fill in the gaps. So yeah, almost everything there was 4-bit dithered. And if you look at it now, if you go back and like play that game on an emulator, you can probably see, especially because it's much sharper than it would have been on a television, you can probably see the dithering patterns and that sort of thing much better now. But I mean, everything was, how do we both achieve the look that we're going for and then just squeeze it so, like, it's just as far as you can. Another thing that I was thinking about that was a shift in perspective coming from PC games was that the goal on console was always to dime the thing, right? Like, if you're not using 100% of your CPU power all the time, it's a missed opportunity. You could be doing something else. And that was sort of different where, if you're working in a normal sort of programming environment, really you're looking to sort of minimize the time slice that you're taking away from everything else. I think I guess there are a couple different ways you can think about optimization, but that one in particular I think is interesting because you're not looking to reduce the CPU load. You're looking to just squeeze more into it.
That's fascinating optimization. I mean, in one sense, you cared a lot at Humongous about being able to run on an immense spec hand-me-down machine, right? Because some kids got like some 12-year-old PC or whatever. So you care about optimization for sure, but not about squeezing, but more about how many machines can you support and how effective can you make this where it's almost the opposite.
Yeah.
With your
Yeah.
next
And
role. That's fascinating.
in the same way that, everything old is new again, those early lessons really set me up. Even now, working from the most constrained platform is a thing that I really believe in. If we're going to like simultaneous launch on PC and consoles, the move is to design the experience for the most constrained, right? You can add more, but there's only so far that you can squeeze and create a satisfying experience without then sort of cutting the things that make it great at some point, right? You author for that bigger platform, the things that you love there tend to fall on the floor a little bit.
And I guess in addition to that, like talking about optimization, I think I've heard a lot of kind of lower level programmers talk about sometimes the negotiations that had to happen between, the art team and the programming team, and how much memory can be taken up for, the balancing act, right?
Yeah, there's a tension there.
Right. But it also sounds like you kind of like you seem to enjoy getting the most out of getting the most out of your system regardless. So I guess for you, like, was it more of have you ever felt like it was a performance versus visual thing, or is it to you like we're gonna max it out as much as possible?
I think you try to make the pragmatic choice, right? It's usually some balancing act. It's not an if this then that. It's more how do we get you 80% of the quality that you're looking for, and it costs 20% of what the current effect costs, that sort of thing, right? So, it's always a collaboration, and I think sometimes sometimes people get frustrated, but for the most part, I think I've been lucky enough to work with people who all know the score, right? And if you're all sort of on the same page in the sense that you have the ultimate vision in mind, and the route that you take there is sort of is the negotiation that you're talking about. I think that's the healthy way to approach it.
So it's like Sony first and second parties, they're notorious for having some of the best like graphics in the industry, period.
Yeah.
What is Sony doing to kind of foster that level of performance?
So I've been away for a bit from Sony. Well, I've been away for so I was looking at my award for the audio systems on Sly, and it's from 2004, which is a ridiculous amount of time.
Man.
I know that stings, right? So what was the question again?
Oh, I was just asking, like, what did Sony do to kind of foster?
Right. Yeah. So I think the thing that they've done really is the team sizes have exploded. When I was leaving Sucker Punch, we were in the process of growing from sort of in the low double digits to triple digits, and I think that a lot of AAA teams have gone big that way. I think that there are a lot of triple digit, multi-100 person teams working on these things now, and it's just before the show, you and I were talking a little bit about maybe the promising aspects of the AI sort of generative stuff that we're seeing now. My hope is that if there's a light side to that, it's helping to sort of create the massive amounts of content that are required to sort of create these believable worlds now.
So AI is being used to kind of generate the content, and a human comes in after to kind of curate and tweak it.
Yeah, that's kind of the workflow that I imagine is some sort of iterative process where you start with a model, the computer generates a result based on that model, you tweak that result, the computer learns from your tweaks, iterate from there. And that's speculative, but I suspect that some version of that happens.
do you foresee like programmers losing their jobs because AI is just becoming so powerful, or?
It's hard for me to imagine that. I mean, I'm never say never, but I think that it's probably a shift in roles, right? Or a reduction in busy work. It's hard to say. We're in very early days. I think that we are still probably at least a decade away from seeing the sort of thing even now that I'm kind of describing. So yeah, there's probably a future where it changes the nature of the gig, but the number of people potentially doing it, I don't know. I don't know what impact that has. It might when you talk about huge art staffs who are generating tons and tons of just sort of environmental bits, whatever, maybe AI helps with that, but I don't know.
It's an interesting question. I
It is an
think,
interesting question, and I think it's going to be super interesting to keep an eye on.
Yeah. I mean, I heard a good comparison the other day, that when calculators came out, there was a lot of fear that, mathematicians would be put out of work, right? And it's
Sure.
like, well, and you're like, well, or those mathematicians no longer have to do the
Yeah.
grunt work. Like
Yeah, and
they've
when books
up-leveled the
came
problems
out,
they work on. Yeah.
people weren't going to memorize things anymore, right? Books were going to be the downfall of man. So I don't worry too much. Things change; they always have, and that won't stop.
Yeah, we got a question from the audience. Patrick Malloy asked, "What is your opinion on hyper-realistic and hyper-polished graphics? I miss lo-fi graphics."
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a place for both. I respect and kind of love the technical accomplishment of seeing the level of realism that's happening now. I think that especially when I think that the thing that I had been looking for when we started seeing subsurface scattering modeling and skin started looking right in games, like that was kind of a moment where I was like, oh, something changed again. That's cool. I remember back in like the early 2000s when hardware acceleration was, no, I guess this would be late 90s, but hardware acceleration was really just coming in. I think the first like NVIDIA chips were available. There was like the Voodoo and stuff. And we were talking about a day when 3D graphics would not be, when everything wasn't shiny, right? When everything didn't look like it was made of plastic. And we're certainly there now. It's been crazy cool to watch. But I'm with you, man. I love the lo-fi too. And I especially, like I said, I love I like things that are stylized, that give you sort of a unique frame on the world. Like I can see reality all the time.
Exactly. What are some of the other companies like they've produced something that really wowed you?
So recent favorites, I mean, Forbidden West was great. I think I really enjoyed it, although I think the first one was just like seeing Horizon Zero Dawn for the first time kind of knocked my socks off. Robot dinosaurs are awesome. I'm more of a sci-fi guy than a fantasy guy, I think. So that really sort of like split the difference nicely for me. The one that I've been playing a lot lately is Returnal. I don't know why that game in particular grabbed me. When all of the Souls games I've given me maybe like 30 minutes to 3 different Souls games and been like, this is not my cup of tea. I do not enjoy it. Returnal, I think, is actually not so different, at least in terms of the difficulty curve. But for whatever reason, that one really hooked me. I really like the roguelike. I like things that have generative environments. I think that that's kind of a through line with me. When I was thinking about Happy Fun Sub, those levels were all generated randomly. And it was because I didn't have any resources to like build levels for me. It was just me. But, I mean, that's the promise, I guess. Maybe team size, maybe these giant team sizes drop, but maybe this enables a lot more indies. You know what I mean? there's potential for cool trade-off there. I think anytime that you see technology really democratized, or you see it become much more widely available to people who didn't have the means before, almost always cool art comes from that.
Absolutely. Anybody have any questions?
About the
Curious-
roguelikes. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, what's your favorite indie game that's memorable to you? Like you mentioned indie.
Yeah. Let me look at my Steam collection. I've been playing a few of late. Brian, I play so few PC games, and on the console, I play AAA titles. Okay, so here are a couple that I played recently that I thought were kind of interesting. A Short Hike, I think that counts as indie, right? That one was kind of cool and just very zen, right? We checked that out as a studio at my current gig. I really dug it. Book of Travels was interesting. Hades is not a indie, but I kind of loved it like an indie. I don't know.
I love it too.
I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
gonna ask you about Hades. That was my question. When you mentioned like indie-esque titles,
Yeah.
I gotta ask about Hades.
Yeah, well, and Hades was my recent foray into roguelikes, like pre-Returnal, right? That was the thing that I picked up, and I hadn't been in that genre for a really long time. I was really excited to see what they were doing with it. Like the way that they had worked in narrative elements, I thought was super cool.
If no one's played Hades here, I highly recommend it. Like I will gift it. It's that good. Like I think everybody should at least just see the atmosphere and like what they have going for it. Like it doesn't feel like a roguelike almost. The way that they have it set up, like the story and stuff, it's like you live, die, and you repeat, but then every time you come back, you get like little bits of information about.
Yeah, there's a little more every time,
Yeah.
right? That like
Yeah.
every run kind of matters. They make
Yeah.
all the weapons, I think, are compelling in their way. There's none. There weren't anywhere I was like, this is garbage, and I don't want to use it.
Right.
Yeah.
Really nice. Yeah, aesthetically pleasing as well. Like it's a really nice roguelike. Like that game, and then like
I kind of felt that same way about Returnal. Like weapons that I started out going, I hate this. This is slow. I hate the reload time. Almost everything turns out to be pretty useful if you give it a shot. And I thought that was, it was nicely done.
I haven't played Returnal yet. I don't have a console. I'm
Yeah.
mostly a PC gamer. So
Yeah.
I'm waiting for it to drop on PC.
I think it's coming, is it not?
It's rumored to be, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just
Um,
waiting for Sony to push the button.
Brian, I think you talked a big game and said I had a lot of stories about optimizing on PS2. I have one in my pocket that I thought I would tell just because it's the one that I won an award for. So if you guys are up for it, the audio streaming system on Sly was I won a Gang Award for Best Interactive Score for that one. And the reason I think it's kind of cool is that it gets into some of the constraints. It also gets into like a ton of specifics of the PS2 in the sense that we were doing, I'll give you an example. So, well, let me just start from the top. So the idea was that we wanted to have music that was dynamic to a degree, right? That when you were in an action sequence, if you were in combat, the music would get excited. There was sort of a normal sort of music track. And then if you were sneaking, we'd sort of like bring out most of the orchestra and like dial it back to just sort of like bass plucks, boom, 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 as you were sort of moving through the environment, that sort of thing. And the composer I was working with at the time, we talked a lot about different approaches to doing dynamic music. There were different technologies that were kind of in use. There were sort of MIDI style, like truly dynamic music where you were branching at particular moments in the piece, and you would actually like, you had virtual instruments that were playing all the parts. Composers mostly hated working that way. It didn't let them control the beats in the way that they wanted frequently. it was also really complex, and the tools for authoring that sort of music were terrible for the most part. So the thing that we came up with, which is not really that complicated, but it worked out well, was he just created tracks that were synchronized and layered in a way that we could bring in any of the. It turned out to be 3 different sort of individual tracks, two stereo pairs and a mono track for the sneaky. And what we would do is compress all that audio and then chop it up. And I had to write a custom compressor to do this. Sony's didn't work on files of ours. For a bunch of reasons, I had to write a custom compressor to Sony's custom format, which was called VAG. It was for the mini disc. I think that's where that technology originated. But we would take the audio track, slice it up, so you'd get maybe a second of audio from the excited track, a second of audio from the normal track, second of audio from the sneaky track. That would come in a chunk, followed by the second, by the third second, right? So it's all interleaved in a single stream on the DVD, and we would just read that in, and then using the fancy DMA controller on the PS2, like shoot those off to the different regions of memory that the different buffers were going to get read from. And then it was just a matter, it was like playing virtual DJ, right? You would just crossfade between the tracks more or less, based on what the sort of unit value that we were using to track how sneaky or how excited the game was. The other sort of hyper optimization that makes this a fun story to tell is that there were, for the most part, Sly Cooper games all fit in memory. The only exception was really the audio streaming, but we also had streaming dialogue, and sometimes that would play in conjunction with streaming music. Our games were pretty small, and the PS2 was pretty small, about 32 megabytes in memory. If you do the math on that, you got a 4 gig DVD, and we only have, say, 8 levels, and each of those is fitting in 32 megs of memory. We got a lot of DVD space left. And so what we did, there was a difference on the PS2 between the delta to make the motor move that moves the laser versus the delta to refocus the laser on an adjacent track. Like, that was a known thing that you could, if you could align your data in such a way that it was close enough, then you could stream these two things next to each other without hearing a seek. And the seeks were a disaster for performance, so you never wanted to do that. And what we would do as a result is restripe the same music file over and over, sort of next to every piece of dialogue that might play in conjunction with, it was actually the flip side of that. But the point is that we would just stripe the same data over and over, so that no matter where you happen to be playing music from, the dialogue was going to be within the delta for the laser to refocus versus the motor move. Ta-da.
That's pretty cool.
I never considered that.
It's silly,
Reading
but
CD.
but it is. I mean, it's the thing that makes working on those old machines fun, is that not only do you have access to, but you kind of must take advantage of those of the hardware at that level to push the envelope, right? Because you've got a ton of competitors, they're all working on the exact same hardware you are. And so if you're looking for a competitive advantage, that's where it's going to come from, is these sort of micro optimizations. And it's fun because the hardware is exotic, and it just, every generation, at least at that time, you learned an entire new piece of hardware. And it was like universally crazy too. Like the things that the PS3 was insane in its way. They were all kind of broken in their way. Like the PS1 famously, I think, did not have perspective correct texture mapping. And then like MIP mapping, I think, was semi-broken on the PS2. But whatever. I mean, they made amazing titles for those things.
I'd love to hear about like your work on the Connect too, right? Like you.
Mm.
Mm,
Yeah, I did work on Connect. I did that. Oh, that was fun. God, I hadn't thought about it in a while. Yeah, so I did a gig at Microsoft. I think they called us like the software Ronin. My gig there was essentially that I was a senior developer who was attached to teams who were publishing through Xbox. And I would do things like occasionally contribute technology, due diligence on studios, make sure that they could deliver what they said they could deliver, that sort of thing. That part of the gig wasn't that fun. But the Nat Geo thing sort of came out of the blue. I don't remember like how I got attached to that project, but during that Connect era, Microsoft was really like they wanted it on everything. And we did this collaboration with Nat Geographic. The game was fine. The Kinect technology was moderately cool. The thing that I remember most about that is that I got to travel to Montana and see like a grizzly bear in person for the first time, and it was the coolest thing. That I actually fell in love with Montana during that period of game development. But yeah, the thing that was neat, I think, about Kinect is that it was the very early mover in machine learning, in my perception anyway. I'm trying to think whether there were early examples or earlier examples in consumer tech that were really using ML. And I think that was, anyway, it was I think the first time it really came into my consciousness.
yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, I think my first E3 was the year that the Connect was revealed, and I remember just this huge line for people to play the Connectimals, and so yeah.
Yeah, I think that the thing that kind of burned me, I think that there were some really interesting titles for Connect, but one of the problems that I don't think this is unique to Microsoft, but they wanted that technology to succeed so badly, and I think that they really were looking at the success of the Wii, and it was very much like, we can go one better, but they were focused on trying to make everything make sense on Connect, and as a result, you saw a ton of games during that era that made no sense at all. Like, I don't know whether it ever saw the light of day, but I know there was a Gears of War Connect prototype that was going on that I played a few times, and I was like, why is this? But there were cool things. Like I think I still have my Connect in my 360 here somewhere with the Gunstringer. Did you guys see that? That was cool. That game, you were a virtual puppeteer controlling a undead zombie gunslinger puppet through a Wild West world that was kind of like puppet sets. It was like they broke the third wall, or they broke the fourth wall, and there was like a Sam Elliott-esque narrator over the top, and the dialogue was dynamic, and it was based on the actions you were taking during the game. So it's like, you pulled out a 6-shooter and gave them both barrels. That sort of thing would happen, like as you were doing this at the screen, and I thought it was clever and actually like a really good use of the technology. Those were just very few and far between.
Yeah, we got a question from the audience. Patrick Malloy asks, people say COD re-releases the same game every title. Can you share your thoughts on that?
I don't have thoughts on Call of Duty because I don't play it. Yeah, I mean, there are all of these big franchises are that way. I mean, I think I've heard the same complaint about Madden. NBA 2K, like choose your franchise. I mean, these are the cash cows that keep those publishers going, and I guess to the extent that they help fund more experimental work, maybe that's cool. That's my most sort of positive spin on it. I don't know. I mean,
sports-
look, these are well executed games by really talented teams. I don't want to undermine what COD does. Like those are great games. It's just not my flavor.
So yeah, I know you worked at Sucker Punch. Did they model the character of Infamous One after you?
So there was a rumor that Dimitri from Paris, who's the sort of lounge lizard, in the day I was, living large, and there were rumors that character was somewhat based on me. I think the real story is that might have been partially true, but it was also based on an artist called Dimitri from Paris, who my friend, the art director, who was way into at the time.
Got it. So like I know E3 has kind of been taking a back seat lately. Like a lot of the big three are not showing up to that anymore. Do you kind of miss the big conferences?
Kind of, yeah. E3 was cool, especially I think when I had never been there before. Like those early days, it was fun because you went to Vegas and there were the games, and then there was the, I forget what they call it. Like there was the Hall of Shame, right, where the really weird gadgets live, and that was always fun to visit. GDC was kind of a mixed bag over my time. Like the years that I was attending, it kind of came and went. Some years it was, I think, late 90s, early aughts. It was not particularly good, and then it got very good again. I think that they started getting some really top tier speakers doing a lot of really top tier technical presentations that had sort of previously been the domain of SIGGRAPH. So I think GDC was pretty good for my professional development in some ways. E3 was just fun. And it's fun to see what other people are doing, right? It's fun to like see the stuff that was coming out.
So I know you've primarily been under kind of like the Sony banner. You did a little bit with Microsoft. Did you ever get into the console wars? I know it gets pretty hectic.
I think that I was a Nintendo partisan early, and then I kind of switched teams. When like basically, I think during that era when I think GameCube was my last Nintendo console. Again, Nintendo's still doing awesome stuff. I just don't have one. But when they sort of decided that they didn't want to play the performance game against Microsoft and Sony anymore, they went their own route. I respect them for doing it, and I think that they made a lot of like clever games. Some of them were more like the Wii. I felt like was more of a toy than the sorts of games that I was interested in playing during that era, and so. Sony had sort of taken over the market power and had the coolest exclusive, and that's kind of why I went that way, I think. But I think that there are great things on all the platforms, and Nintendo like maintains a stable of remarkable exclusives, right? Like that you just can't play anywhere else.
I'd love to, I guess, so this is a question I get a lot from like new game programmers, and I feel a certain type of way, but I would be interested in hearing your thoughts.
Yeah.
So when somebody's learning how to program, how to make a game, right?
Yeah.
I am usually in the camp that's fiercely don't even attempt to make your own game engine if you've never made a game before, right?
Yeah.
But I guess to you, do you think there's value in somebody learning how to create a game engine before learning how to create a game?
It's a good question. I guess it depends on what your goals are. If you want to understand how game engines work, building your own isn't a bad way to do it. That said, there are probably more effective ways to go about it these days, right? Because you can get hold of the Unreal source. The downside to that is Unreal is so huge and so expansive that wrapping your mind, I've been using it for a couple of years now. I'm expert at a few things and have solid domain knowledge on a few others, but the breadth there is not like anything that I've ever worked with before, in the sense that we always said at Sucker Punch, we made a Sly Cooper engine. We didn't make a generic, it wasn't a general purpose engine. It was specifically tailored to build that sort of game. And because Unreal needs to be the kitchen sink, I think it can be daunting to try and understand systems in that breadth. I think there is value to, if you want to understand the 3D pipeline, build yourself a GL triangle. I don't know. Get a spinning cube going. Understand how that stuff works. It matters. And certainly the lessons that you'll learn in terms of, like when I was thinking about why I like C++, and when I read code, specifically that's written in C or C++, like I can picture in my mind, like when I'm looking at it, how it looks in memory, right? How things lay out, where the vtables are, where the pointers are. I can count the indirections and go, I know that that's going to be expensive because it's a random hop. Those are the sorts of things that I think you best internalize through pain and hard experience. You know what I mean? Building your own game engine is a really good way to understand how hard it is to build your own game engine, if nothing else. So maybe don't build a whole engine and expect that you're going to ship a title on it. I don't think that's probably, it's certainly not realistic in the world that we live in today. But yeah, man, there are valuable lessons there. And if you want to job game programming, programming engines, which is kind of what I do, you should probably build an engine at some point.
For sure.
So I've heard a lot of horror stories about the game industry, like long work hours, low pay. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I mean, all those things were true. I think about that first gig. I think it's been 25 years, so I can like blow the whistle. Like when I started there, I made 24 grand, and when I got my first programming gig, I made 25 grand. And it really wasn't for a few years, right? Like I established myself, and then I made myself invaluable, and then I started making strong moves in terms of like trying to drive my salary up. And because I didn't have any college debt and I really didn't have any credentials, right? I still felt like I was winning. Even though I was working, 12 or 16-hour days every day for 10 years or whatever it was, right? Like those early years were heady. I was learning a ton all the time. So yeah, the pay was garbage, and the hours were really long. And for me, that was okay. Because I was kind of going in knowing the score. I don't know. I don't think I would encourage people to approach it from that direction now. And honestly, I don't even know whether my story is at all relevant anymore. It's hard to imagine. I don't know whether I could do what I did in 1995 in 2024. You know what I mean? I mean, certainly not the me of today, but even a hungry 20-year-old version of me, I don't know whether it could be done again. I think there's always a way, right? But it's a rarity.
I think for what it's worth, like I think I started my career in 2012, and I think my first programming job was 33, or I think it was 30K, and also a lot of crunching. So I think it might be more relevant than you realize. But
yeah. I mean, it's certainly not the go-to programming job if you want to make a lot of money. At least not out of the gate, right? I think you can do well. But and honestly, I think base salaries have also increased quite a lot, at least at some of the like AAA studios that I'm familiar with. So those people are reasonably well compensated. It may not be like, I worked at Amazon for some years. and I feel like I was extremely well compensated there. It's not quite the same, but it's, you know, it's close enough that if your love is games, then that trade-off is probably worthwhile. You know what I mean?
I had a similar experience, actually pretty humongous. Like I did contract game testing for Electronic Arts. You want to talk about like work-life balance issues? That was the last 30 days were in a row. And the shifts were 10 a.m. to 4 a.m. So you got 6 hours off, and you got, I mean, you'd be surprised. I mean, there's probably a lot of labor laws being broken, but it started with the contractors, you can eat in the war room, and then somebody left the war room a mess, and then the engineering team came in and complained about it. So you can't eat in the war room anymore. You have to eat at your desk. Well, now you can't eat at your desk because someone got a piece of lettuce from their Subway sandwich on one of the dev kits. And like now you have to eat in the hallway. But then like the executive team came through and like, why are there homeless people like eating in the hallway on the floor? So then they're like, okay, you can eat in the empty offices. And then it was like, no, you have to eat in the parking lot. And then it was like, no, you're not allowed to eat on campus. Like you have 30 minutes to eat lunch. You have to leave, you have to eat, and you have to come back in 30 minutes. And then you have to be back in 6 hours and do it all over again the next day.
I have a friend who tells a really funny story about quitting his job as a tester at Nintendo. They had been locking the employees in, except for a lunch break, and he and his buddy like got out at lunch and looked at each other like, "Dude, let's get out of here." And that was the end of their employment.
And it's funny to think about those painful memories as being fun memories now, but I don't know why. But
yeah, I mean, it's shared pain, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I got a question for you folks. Do you, so I was thinking, you know, it's rare that I get a chance to sort of reflect on my early career, and I was thinking about like the power of delusion, like my level of naivete combined with like my just sort of the level of surety, like the inevitability of Steve, that this was going to happen for me because I was just, you know, I was so motivated and I was going to work harder than anyone else. And that actually happened. And I don't know whether it was because I didn't know any better. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I totally get what you're saying.
I've heard like similar tales. I think that, you know, I don't know if I should name drop it, but I think Ron Gilbert told me at one point that like they only succeeded because they didn't know that they couldn't. That sort of thing, you know. I think it's there's something there that's
it's like
that surety of youth. I think is there's power in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the immovable, it's the unrelenting force almost, right? And you just
Completely.
kind of just keep going and going. Like
I think that was actually one of the things that I had this conversation with a manager the other day, and I think that one of the real valuable things I got from those early programming experiences when I was like pounding out BASIC on my TI was that like tenacity. I didn't actually know what I was typing in at the time, right? I could kind of like intuit what these commands might mean. You know, I mean, it's kind of English. It's English. But I didn't really know what I was doing. And I remember being hugely frustrated. And someone pointed out to me at one point that the reason my program wasn't running was because I didn't know the difference between a colon and a semicolon, right? And I just did it. Like I just kept going and just beating my head against the wall until I figured it out. And I think that like those early failures and just like the being comfortable failing over and over and over again, that turned out to be a really valuable skill because it is the one that I still rely on probably more than anything else.
Yeah,
it's pretty interesting, but I kind of believe like God puts something in us and we have to dig it out, because I don't even really like speaking, but for some reason I'm running a podcast and I gotta keep going with it.
Good man.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah,
definitely. Like I would say, like what did they say? Like ignorance is bliss. Like
Yeah.
there's pretty much days where I remember being at Starbucks from freaking 11 o'clock at night to like 5 a.m. in the morning reading a JavaScript book.
Yeah.
And I thought, all right, if I read this book from A to Z, like
Then I will know.
They can't reject me, right? Like
Yes.
that didn't work.
No.
But ultimately, like I didn't realize that I was like setting a foundation, like brick by brick, like day by day. It's about consistency most of all, right?
Yes.
It's almost like being ignorant, but not in the negative connotation, more so in the I'm gonna fall down and get right back up. Like look at a child, right? When they're learning to walk, they fall.
Yeah.
But they don't whine or cry or whatever. They just get back up and they keep walking, or they keep trying anyway, right?
Yeah,
So
because there's no other
same
option,
way.
right? What are you going to do?
Exactly. Yeah. So
yeah,
I
that's
totally
sort of
get you.
taking away from yourself the possibility of failure. I don't know. I mean, this sounds pretty pop psychology now because that's obviously not all there is to it, but there is power in this sort of thing, I think.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
really staking yourself all in on an idea. You know, like especially those first 5 years when I was working, it was like 12-hour days at the office, and then I would come home and read for like 5 hours every night. And I don't know what my recall, you know, like whether it was equivalent to what I would have gotten out of university ultimately, but you know, I mean, it was different. And I feel quite prepared now. You know, I mean, I've worked at least one of the fangs, so I'm bona fide, you know?
Absolutely.
I'm very curious, Steve, like as you were talking, I remember how hard most video games were that I played when I was younger.
Yeah.
Like Mega Man, Ninja Gaiden, like all these games that are like Super Ghouls and Ghosts, like an arcade game that's just impossible by today's standards. Like you take a game that has infinite lives and give you 3 lives, and you have to pay a quarter each time, and like that's the kind of games we played. I'm wondering, do you think
whether there's some tenacity that comes from that?
That's like if you played these games and you didn't like
did get used to failing, that's true.
Like, and not giving up, right? That like there's no gamer I know that hasn't played a Super Meat Boy that knows what quitting means, right? Like because they'll play a game 1,000 or 2,000 times. I wonder if that's like there's some survivor bias, that the people who wanted to go into games were the ones who loved playing a hard game so much that they were like, this is just a part of who I am and I want to build these things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I certainly was building them as much for me as for an audience. I think that the joy of it now is the idea that, you know, I've built some things that will outlast me, maybe, or at least like they'll live on in somebody's memory somewhere. It's funny, like I had a oblique conversation with one of the principals at Sucker Punch a couple of years ago, and I think that the longest lived thing that I did there is the thing that I'm like least proud of. I think that I wrote like a Unicode library at some point, and that lived on way beyond like the code that I had written for Sly or anything, because it carried into, I think, some of the infamous titles and maybe even into Ghosts. I don't know, but
so speaking on that, right? When you make those libraries, can you claim that, like, when they get reused in other projects, can you be like, oh, my library was used in Sly and Infamous and et cetera, or do you just
like
only get the credit for the first time? Like,
I mean,
is it a collective thing, or do you just say, I wrote that?
So yeah, I mean, you can in terms of like claiming it on your resume, you can claim that forever. Yeah, for sure. And you know, Sucker Punch, I think, was very kind and gave me a special thanks on at least the first Infamous, because I had worked a little bit on early animation systems there, and I think that you know, like I had minor influence on that game, and I think that, you know, a lot of studios are happy to give credit where credit's due that way. But yeah, I mean, you as an individual should definitely take credit.
Have you met any of the big names in the industry, and what are your experiences with them, like a Kojima, Miyamoto?
So the biggest names that I know are probably like the big name Japanese developers I have very little contact with. I knew a fair amount of the cats at both Insomniac and Naughty Dog during the sort of mid-aughts. So I probably have some overlap there. I knew Dave, so I met Dave Perry from Shiny a few times. I actually worked with Sax Persson, who in the late 90s, there was a game called Messiah that sort of famously claimed to solve the polygon problem. They had done like some real-time tessellation stuff. The game wasn't a hit, but Sax was a very smart guy, and he was at Xbox when I was at Xbox. So yeah, I mean, like minor celebrities, people who are famous, but only to people who care about video games. Ron Gilbert was the studio head at Humongous, my first gig. I didn't know it at the time, but Ron was a legend, right? Like Ron made Maniac Mansion before that, and actually I think just released a sequel recently. But yeah, I kind of accidentally worked with some pretty big names. Bruce Dawson, he does a lot of publishing. He's like the engine dev, so he does a lot of writing on like specific hyper optimizations or real low down details on problems with the FPU on particular processors, or like that's his domain. When we were at Humongous, he was looking at how to emulate the signal sort of interference that we would get taking our 640 by 480 VGA graphics and then putting them on an NTSC television, right? Because people were still using those. And he actually like wrote a simulator that did some signal processing, and like it was cool. Smart guy. I've been pretty lucky to work with a lot of smart people.
Bruce is an interesting character. I remember some of the optimization things that he talked about.
Well, and when I was talking about the Island of Misfits, like Bruce is one of those, right? He was not a trained computer scientist. He went to clown school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like juggling on a unicycle, like legit.
Yeah, he would teach like slackline classes at lunch.
Yeah. Like I remember him telling me, like just as an example of what Steve said about being an engine programmer, like he was telling me his, like, you guys ever play Pikmin? Do you remember the game Pikmin with the little
love it.
Went around? Yeah. So he was telling me about how he's come up with a plan to finish the game losing 0 Pikmin.
Wow.
Like, and did it in like 11 days. Like, and if you remember the game, I think the game gave you like 30 days to play the game. And if you've ever played the game, you lose like, it's like playing Lemmings for people who haven't played Pikmin. There's almost no way to not lose Pikmin.
Yeah, I can totally see that. That Bruce like played that game for half an hour and is like, well, this is an optimization problem.
Exactly. And he said it so casually, and I just remember thinking that was like peak Bruce Dawson was like,
totally
like I can play Pikmin and not lose a single Pikmin and finish it in 11 days, right? So
yeah, that sounds right.
So yeah, what are you doing now? After you left Sucker Punch and
so I let's see, I was at Sucker Punch. Now you're gonna make me refer to my resume. I can't remember the order of these things anymore. Where did I go after that? So Microsoft, I suppose. No, I had an interim in there. So I actually started a studio with some friends from Sucker Punch. We did that for a couple of years. Released 2 games actually. Like released one game for the Wii. That was supposed to be called Tornado Alley. It ended up being called Tornado Outbreak. It was a pretty cool game. The concept was sort of reverse Katamari, and you were a tornado who would just go through and wreck cities, and then like the tornado would grow and then you would wreck larger things. It was kind of Yeah, it was Katamari in reverse. That was fun. It was a fun experience. But indie studios, it's a roll of the dice, right? Sometimes you catch fire, sometimes you don't. Eventually, those folks, I think, all rolled into PopCap, and then I rolled out to work at Xbox for a while. So I was doing the Ronin gig. I worked on like a South Park game. That was kind of funny because my first day at Microsoft, they didn't really have an office for me. They didn't really have a computer for me. They set me up in this closet, and then a guy came by. He was the lead on this South Park tower defense game that was going to be releasing in like 3 weeks. And he's like, hey, let me give you a rundown on what I'm doing. And then he's like, all right, I'm headed to the Bahamas. Peace. And that was the last time I ever saw him. And then, so essentially, like, I had to ship that title knowing essentially nothing about it. It was fine. It worked out, but it was ridiculous.
Wow.
Did you guys have any other questions?
Oh man, I was just about to ask something. I forgot.
I've got to recommend, if you guys are interested in cool old school stories, go find Jordan Mechner's like The Making of the Prince of Persia. Because of my age and like my era, like that's a game that I played when it was the right age to really get that in my head. But for its era, it had there was a reality to the animation that was not like other things that I had played. And the reason is that it was rotoscoped, and you can go and find the footage. It's bananas. You can find the footage. They found it a few years back of the VHS tape that he made of his brother doing the moves that he then rotoscoped to make the animation for that game. There are a ton of interesting details about that. He was essentially writing his own disk driver to, the same sort of thing that I was talking about on PS2, but different era, different technology. Like you could actually like optimize the amount of information you could squeeze onto a floppy by writing your own driver on the disk. And he was doing that sort of magic. Really, really cool stuff, like good old school stories.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. What were some of the landmark games to you? Like I know, like Resident Evil really blew up the survival horror genre. Metal Gear Solid.
I mean, I'll call Mario 64 because I think, like everyone, that was the one that changed my world. Right? That was the thing that made. There had been a few examples of 3D games that I had seen before, but watching a 2D platform translated so perfectly to 3 dimensions and executed so flawlessly, I still I haven't played it in years, but I still think it's kind of magic. I would call out the Sly series. I thought that was really, I'm proud of those. I think that of all the ones that I've worked on in my career, it's the one that I look back on with the very fewest number of criticisms for the final product. I mean, certainly there were things that were limited about it. Where are we at time-wise? You guys want to hear the puppeteering story? Am I gonna blow your budget?
Oh no. We can stay however long you want to stay.
So one of the things that we did to make the cutscenes on Sly Cooper cheaper, doing FMV and rendering all those out and then storing them on disk and all that sort of thing, it was not so much the disk space. We talked about that. That wasn't really a problem, but rendering out FMV usually required you to have people who had a ton of cinematics experience, slightly different skill set, rendered at high quality. Then you have all these questions about how do we match the style of the game, etc. In-engine cutscenes were still, I think, not super common at that point, but the cheap alternative that we came up with was this sort of puppeteering approach. Essentially what happened is that the artists would author a whole bunch of poses like different head positions, different body poses, and then we fed those all into this tool. And what would happen is that we would author the cutscenes so that the audio would play back with the right characters in the room. But a production assistant, like, it didn't really matter. Like, anyone who had sort of an eye for the way that things should get blocked could come in and pick up a PS2 controller. And what you would do is you would sweep over the scene, and at any point, like, I had mapped different channels to different buttons on the controller. So if you were looking to adjust the eye look, you would hit like R trigger and then move the stick up into the right or whatever. Or for other things where we had like a discrete set of poses, you would choose the body and then a stance or whatever. And those were time synced. So you were just essentially in engine keyframing the animations that were going to make up the cutscenes. That wasn't particularly magic, but it was kind of novel. It's maybe another example of where your constraints can sort of lead to clever solutions, right? We had neither the staff, budget, or time to really do all of this stuff, and so this was a solution where we could take all the recorded dialogue and pretty quickly block out semi-believable sequences, and then have a pro come in and kind of refine it, run it through the lip sync processor so that the mouth movements lined up, that sort of thing.
It's interesting to see the overlap with some of what you're talking about there, and the talkie tokens. I remember from from Humongous about a production assistant coming in and sort of tweaking that stuff, because we never really, go ahead. I want you to tell that story.
Oh, no. I just remember that we did it all by hand in the early days, and then we eventually we switched over to something that did phoneme recognition, and then we would essentially like auto-gen that stuff. But even then, I think it required a little bit of tweaking by hand.
Yeah.
That state of the art still hasn't changed a lot. It doesn't feel like. I don't know. There's some tools that we're looking at now that are supposed to pull some degree of emotional context out of dialogue and apply that to characters. I'm dubious. We'll see.
Yeah.
Maybe they've solved it. I mean, I have a fair amount of faith in ML and a lot of this interesting applications of AI, but that problem seems harder than that. I don't think that you can pull enough context out of a simple voice channel.
We're doing something similar at my job right now.
Are you now?
I feel the same way. Like, it feels very dubious to me. Like, you mean you could tell me how I'm supposed to emote a word just based on the word? That feels, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, is that a question, or is that person just Canadian?
Okay. Both, yeah.
I remember, Steve, I want to ask you about your feelings on Metal Gear Solid. I remember it's a game you like to play a lot. Like in game development, especially at Humongous, we had a library of, gosh, I don't know what, Steve, like 300 games, 400 games, like they were in these bookcases. And so
a ton of them, yeah.
Yeah, so you could check out any game, which just meant, and we always played games like during lunch and, and then after work and before work for some people. And so we got to know a lot of games that had nothing to do with.
Had a Killer Instinct machine in the kitchen for a while, if I remember right.
Yeah, we played Battlefield and Tribes, all these games that that were early network games as well. But I remember Steve playing a fair amount of Metal Gear Solid. I was curious what he thought about that game.
I did play the hell out of that one. That was so good, especially that. So there was NES Metal Gear Solid, right, which I also really loved as a kid. But the one that I think we're talking about is like PS1 era. Is that right?
NES was Metal Gear, right? And so that was the one that was kind of harder.
Yes.
And everybody always died because they fell off the bridges that were moving arbitrarily left to right, which was infuriating. And you throw your controller. But I'm talking about the cinematic.
Yeah, I mean, it did. For its era, I think it felt as cinematic as anything that I had seen. I was a person who loved books and movies, and narrative has always been kind of the appeal to me for games. Like I at the end of the day, I'm mostly a single player gamer, right? Like I like the big AAA single player experiences for the most part. And it's because I like characters and narrative and all that sort of thing. And I think that Metal Gear Super nailed that. They also had like all the little clever moments, you know, I thought it was hilarious, the hiding in the box, you know, or the get up against the wall and the rap to pull guards in. I think that actually might have been the impetus for the same feature with the headset in Sly. You know, they made it a lot more integral to the game, but you know, for reasons that whatever. Metal Gear Solid was amazing, excellently
It was
executed.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember playing that. I remember watching Steve play that game, and I was like, "This game is gorgeous. I want it." Like, it was almost as fun to watch someone else play that game as it was to play that game. And for
Yeah.
me as a spectator, I'd never felt that way about another single player game. Like, you were engrossed in it yourself because you were the player. But I
Yeah.
never really enjoyed watching someone else play until
No.
that game came out. And I remember I
Interesting.
played that game all the way through, I think in one session. Like, I think I sat down and played it nonstop. And I was just, it wasn't a terribly long game. Like, you know, it's not a Final Fantasy grind the hours out or anything like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, you could probably play through that game in, you know, half a day. I don't
Yeah.
really remember anymore, but that
Yeah.
sounds about right for the amount of content that you could even, you know, reasonably fit. That
Yeah.
seems about right.
And I finished that game, and then I was like, I don't want to stop playing. I went and I started it over and played it again all the way through. Just like, how fast can I do this now that and it was identical storyline. I mean, there's no randomness to it.
Yeah.
But I remember just being like, I don't want. It was like a book I didn't want to end. Right?
I
It
think-
was like, man.
You reminded me actually, like when we were thinking about, you know, influential games from my past. I think that Bionic Commando is probably somewhere on that list. Specifically, not the arcade game, but the NES version, right? Because that took it in a very like almost RPG direction. It was kind of Metal Gear Solid-ish in terms of like the narrative, and there was this whole plot line about like bringing Hitler back to life. It was bananas, and I remember being super impressed by that for especially the platform that it was on at the time. Plus, there was something very cool about the swinging dynamic. They executed that, I think, really well for the time. You know, in a world where Insomniac's Spider-Man exists, that's not quite as impressive, but you know, different days.
I guess talking about Metal Gear Solid, when you're talking about kind of the hardware and taking the edge of like utilizing the hardware in those kind of early console days, I think about how revolutionary it felt with the whole Psycho Mantis fight in Metal Gear Solid and switching controller ports and like such a small thing, right? But
I
like,
sometimes forget about that. They had you put the controller on the ground and it would vibrate. He's like, I'm going to make it vibrate for you. You remember that? I
Yeah,
thought about
there
that
wasn't
for
just
years.
that. There was the wasn't there a torture part too where you had to mash a button
Yeah,
like
that
for
sounds
60
right.
seconds, and then you had to do it like 6 times in a row, and like your
Yep.
arms were getting sore.
You were
Like there was
tired.
like you were like, dude, like you had a friend. You're like, dude, come do this. Like I'm like I can't click that fast. I've
It's
been
like press the
1,000
space
button
bar
mashes.
3000.
Yeah, exactly.
Then Metal Gear 3 had something similar where if you I don't know if you guys have played Metal Gear 3, but there's a sniper in that in the game, and if you were to turn the game off and then come back like in a week, hit and start the game up, the sniper would be dead. This because the sniper's like he's like a super old guy or whatever, and so like when the game would load up again, he would be dead. Like Snake would be like, cutscene would play, and Snake would be like, "What happened to him? Oh, he died of old age."
That's a funny
'Cause
Easter
you-
egg.
Yeah, you can get the same glitch if you mess with the PS2's clock as well. But yeah, it's pretty much like it's crazy how in depth Kojima thought about that type of stuff. He's like, what if you change the clock on the game and something happened in the actual game?
Yeah, and yet it sounds so like him, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, because it just seems like a random flight of fancy that really it's only going to be seen by a tiny audience, and yet
Yeah.
it was a thing that he just decided, yeah, we should do that.
Yeah, that reminds me. Did you guys ever play was it Super Mario Brothers 3? Which was the one that had the very first like raccoon outfit that you could play as? I
The
think it was-
Tanuki
I think
suit.
that was
that's-
3.
Yeah, the
Yeah, it's
Tanuki.
3, man.
Yeah, 3. So somebody went looking on like the hardware and looking at the art, right, that was stored on it. And as they're going through it, they see this Tanuki animation and they can't figure out where in the game it's ever played. And it's actually Tanuki sliding down an incline. But the thing about Tanuki, if you ever played the game, was he could never slide. Because anytime you'd press down, he would like turn into stone, I think is what he would do. And he would never pick up momentum. So people are racking their brain going, where the hell does this even show up? And it turns out there is one place in that whole game where you can slide down a hill and pick up the Tanuki suit while you're sliding. That is the only place where that frame is used in that entire game.
And they made it for that.
And they made it for that one spot.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, the level of detail in that kind of stuff is boggles me a little bit.
Yeah.
It indicates a thoughtfulness that a lot of game designers don't have time for or just don't make a priority for, and so it just feels rare and special.
Yeah.
Nope, we're not taking up too much of your time.
No, I'm good. I think I'm starting to fade a little bit. I'm at the end of a 4-day planning session, so you can hear probably my voice is starting to get a little rough. I've exhausted my beverages, but this is fun. I would I so rarely get an opportunity to like think back on the career, and then like some of these stories are fun, and you just sort of they get lost in the mists. I hadn't thought about some of this stuff in years.
I know you mentioned you really like sci-fi. Did you get into the Mass Effect series?
A little bit, yeah. I played Mass Effect on the 360. I think I played 2. Yeah, I played both of those. The first one I was into, and then I think in both cases I dropped off after a while. I don't know why that one didn't really. It didn't hit me like, say, a Dead Space, which was a sci-fi game that I really did get into. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I think it had more to do with the sort of level of depth of role playing, which was kind of not the level that I wanted to engage with at that point. You know what I mean? Like the time investment was kind of a little more than I was looking for.
Yeah, Dead Space was an excellent series. Did you play part 1 and 2?
I'm really looking. I've only played 1, and I'm really looking forward to this reimagining.
It's good.
Oh, yeah.
It's
What,
good.
what
It's
about
worth
the
it.
Callisto Protocol? I heard it's pretty similar.
Yeah, both of those definitely looking forward to. I'm still, like I said, I've been trying to 100% Returnal, and so until that's done, I'm not picking up anything new. But
Okay.
that day is within sight. Finally beat
Yeah.
the last boss.
Yeah, I wish I had that discipline. I just usually end up switching games all the time.
I have tons of friends who, have Steam libraries that are full of hundreds of games. I think I'm kind of missing out. I suspect that there are tons and tons of, triple I, independent games that I haven't seen. Tons of cool stuff on PC. The bar to entry is lower on PC, and for that reason, I think that you can. It's like horror movies, right? Like, I think that a lot of good art happens in horror movies. A lot of interesting things happen there because the bar to entry is fairly low, and you can almost always make your money back. I don't know if that's necessarily the sense for the case for PC games, but I do think that it's a good example of that democratization. I see a lot of clever things. Like people point me at games and I'm like, I should check that out, but I don't because, you know, I'm trying to learn to play this guitar, man.
As you get a little bit up in age, you find like work-life balance is a lot more important than it used to be.
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, you know, I got married. I couldn't sustain a relationship during those first like 10 years of my, you know, I had relationships, but it could never have grown beyond what it did because I was, you know, I was both not that person and I was just 100% focused on work. And so, yeah, I mean, things change. I changed. And, you know, over the years, the amount of new things that you have to learn versus the amount of time that it takes to learn them, that there's an inversion that happens, where from me to sort of like really take on something new, learn an entirely new sort of programming concept or whatever, like those are going to be fairly niche and they're going to be probably massive time investments because they're going to be hyper specializations, right? And I've kind of got the box of tools that feels good. It's not that I don't learn anymore, but I don't need as much more to be useful, to make myself useful to the company that I work for. Like I've always kind of thought of myself not as like, this thing for me has not been so much of a career as a way for me to line up all the things that I'm obsessed with doing with people who want to pay me to do those things, right? And so over time, like I've kind of got a good set. There are other fields like you know, I don't want to go off on a tangent with music, but there are things that I can learn a lot more and feel like a satisfying amount of progress in a shorter amount of time that really kind of are expanding my horizons. I spent so much time on this particular problem domain, both professionally and personally. And now it's kind of fun to be able to say, okay, my professional life is my professional life. And when I'm engaged in that, I'm very serious about it. But I do like being able to put it away. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That's one of the reasons I'm doing a podcast. Like you kind of get sick of coding, you know, 8 hours a day studying after work. You know, you need to do.
It's important to have something else. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think specifically something that takes your mind somewhere else, right? Like makes you think in a different way. You know, you probably have all had the experience of working really diligently on a problem, you know, beating your head against it for, you know, hours or days or weeks, and then going for a walk and having the answer coming to you, you know, that sort of thing, right? There's real value in stepping away. You know, you have to do that work, but then you have to get away from it.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
So what is that for you, Steve? Is that music? Or?
It's kind of become that. Yeah. I mean, I was really interested in it when I was younger, and I always had this, I sort of had this idea that I was going to get back into music in my 20s, and then, you know, decades passed, and like, I think I was 40 all of a sudden, and I was like, that didn't happen. I didn't go back to it. I didn't like get into, you know, dance. I didn't get into production of like dance and DJ music, which is like kind of what I was into in my 20s, and you know, still am to a degree. But like, here's the, you know, the wisdom that every old person will share with you is like, now is the time, right? To don't put it off. You don't know how much time you have left, and if there's a thing that you're super interested in, there are real benefits to taking that on, right? Like growth in one field can influence growth in another, right? Like my interest in music has overlap programming a few times. It did with the Sly Cooper audio stuff. I did some interesting work at Microsoft with beat detection for a game that was never released, but that did spark an interest in signal processing that I retain. Like that sort of in particular, I was using Fourier transforms to find particular frequencies and then find the frequencies of those frequencies, right? That sort of, like, in a nutshell, it's kind of easy to say, but essentially what you're doing is just looking for a kick drum, right? And the Fourier transform, like, once you understand, oh, I'm taking things in the frequency domain and I'm translating into the time domain, or vice versa, like, that is a cool tool to have in your bag. And then at some point in your programming career, maybe that comes up. I don't know. Or you get interested in music like I did, and then maybe you're interested in doing synthesis, and you can apply those techniques to modulation or something like that. I don't know. What I do know is that it's, for me, it's given me like a space to grow and feel like real satisfaction in a way that is hard to achieve in programming after decades.
Yeah. I think there's an incremental amount of learning and probably an awareness too of whatever timeline you imagine you will continue to do this, where you say, okay, well, if it's going to take me weeks, months, or years to learn this, and it's only going to apply for the last 5, 10, 15 years of my career, that's probably something. There's some mental math on ROI probably happening in the back of your head. But
yeah,
I definitely hear find the inverse of what you're doing at work and try to find a hobby that aligns. Like for me, that's woodworking or remodeling,
I love that.
Like, it's like there is no undo, right? I paid $200 for this nice piece of wood, and then you cut it an inch short. Guess what? You're buying another 200. There's no going back. There's the sequence of your events are so much more important, which is not something that I was just accustomed to in tech, right? That a lot of times these things can happen in parallel, and as long as they all get done in a certain time, it's not that big of a deal. But even yesterday, I was cutting the drink rail for my back deck, and it's like a 25-foot piece of composite decking. It's an expensive piece of wood. I still screwed it up, and now now it's short. But now the game part of me is like, okay, I need to make it look intentional. I can put something on the corner here and kind of hide the fact that I made this mistake in it and make it look like it was supposed to be there. Yeah. But that stubbornness in relentless tenacious problem solving, that, okay, well, if that's no longer on the table, I can cuss about it for about 20 seconds, and then I need to move on with my life and figure out, well, I now have a new set of criteria. I'm not paying for another board. So what am I going to do to make this look like it was intentional? And sometimes it leads me to a place that I wouldn't have thought otherwise, because a new constraint's been added, which I think is a core of probably game developers and NASA engineers probably. But
I like to think a lot about how everything is related. My wife bought me welding classes a few years back. It was one of my favorite experiences that I've had recently. I always wanted to be able to do that. I'm still a garbage welder. One day I'll get my own machine and then maybe I'll get good. But learning to do that was super cool. The thing that came along with it, though, was a deeper understanding and a deeper respect for, deeper interest in electricity, what was going on under the hood there. And then we moved into this new house, and it had knob and tube wiring, and we had to tear it all out and replace it. And a couple of things like that started happening, and I started getting really interested in the real details of what's going on with electricity. I didn't, I might have ended up an EE major. I think that would have been a thing that I would have been interested in at university. But that gave me an angle into, okay, well, I'm going to get an oscilloscope and a couple of things, and I'm going to start experimenting with microelectronics. I don't ever expect to make a career out of that, right? Like I'm way down the road. I'm not doing hardware design for Intel. Software is my domain, but having an eye on that stuff and like a little bit deeper understanding, it just makes everything a little bit more satisfying, right? When I know not just like what's happening at the machine software interface, but then like what's happening in the transistors and like what that means when they're getting voltage leakage and like all that stuff. I love the way it ties together. Is that rambly enough?
So I noticed you have that massive stack of books in the background.
Yeah. It's a stealth bookcase. They're not actually just stacked floor to ceiling. But yeah, those are my, these are the ones that I think I keep around for either reference or because I have some sort of emotional or kind of attachment to them, you know, like because they represented some like point in time in my life. Like I've got a copy of Michael Abrash's graphics programming. You can probably see it because it's the book that's like that thick. It's I don't refer to that thing anymore. Like I don't need to know how to latch the VGA, and I'm not optimizing for the UNV pipes on the Pentium. Like those days are gone. But the lessons that I learned from those books, like Zen of Code Optimization, things like that, in the day, you know, I'm gonna keep that book forever because it reminds me of a time when I was sort of, you know, I was learning all those new things that we're talking about. They were all new to me then, and I think it was really exciting.
It reminds me of Brad's bookcase. I remember him talking. Were you in there? I can't remember, but he was saying how this one mutual friend we have, Brad Taylor, like he was trying to get a appraisal for his game library, like his books. But all of these, but it's like 75% of the books that Brad owns are no longer in print. You can't find them anywhere, right?
Totally.
Like he probably has one, like half of the books he has are probably one of 10 copies. So how do you go evaluating that? And it became a really complicated process because like, how do you put a value on that book that you know you're not going to reference probably ever again, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have value to you.
Yeah, I've got a copy of like the one that I always laugh about is Animation Techniques in Win32, right? So this is a book that was about how you made fast indexed color graphics on Windows circa 1995, right? It is such a specific slice of time. It kind of mattered later. I mean, that still remained the best way to do that particular type of thing for probably 5 years afterwards, but it's completely irrelevant today. Like indexed color graphics are barely a thing. There's sometimes an optimization technique. Nobody's doing the sorts of stuff that we did at Humongous where you'd like rotate the palette to make the waterfall look like it was moving, but I like remembering that time. I like that book because I run the risk of like forgetting that it ever existed otherwise.
I guess with that said, I guess a question I'd have is like, if are there like any words of wisdom if you could go back in time and talk to like young, hungry you who just wanted to make things happen, right? If like, is there any advice you'd give yourself at that stage?
I mean, I did all the right things for all the accidental reasons, right? But I guess the thing I would say like is try and find people to be around who are good at their craft. If you can't do that, find books. It's different now, right? Like there's way more content on YouTube and elsewhere than there ever was when I was coming up, and so they're probably like sources that I don't even know about. But I still represent that a lot of the timeless knowledge, like the stuff that stands the test of time, that really matters. There's still a lot of good information in textbooks, and you should own some of those. find talented people and be around them. Like, I don't like whatever field it is that you're trying to get into, like find people who are good and just like watch what they do. If you're a programmer, read their code, look and see, like try and find things that inspire you and like, recreate them. But I guess the thing to do is try and be adjacent to excellence as much as you can, and then let that definition of excellence evolve as you get older, right? Like it'll change and it should change. That's what I've got.
Excellent answer. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions on my end. Did any of you guys have any more questions? Hey, man, we definitely appreciate you coming on, man. We have to have you back.
This was fun. I enjoyed it. Yeah, I'd like to see you all again.
Yeah, it was a fantastic conversation. We like to thank you for coming on. We'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. But we'll catch y'all next time. Peace.
Smash that like button. Smash that subscribe.